Hello and welcome to Politics War Room with James Carville and I'm Al Hunt. This week our guest is Nick Schifrin, who is the Chief Defense and Foreign Affairs Correspondent at PBS NewsHour, and he's done important work in an acclaimed series on what it's like inside Putin's Russia, and he just returned a week or so ago from several weeks in Ukraine. Remember, we love taking your questions, so write in to politicswarroom@gmail.com or send a tweet to @Politicon for next week's show. We'll get to as many as we can, and don't forget to tell us where you're from. Please tell your friends about us and remind them to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. Hey, welcome, Nick Schifrin. James and I are big fans of the NewsHour and your work, especially the great reporting that you did in several weeks in war-ravaged Ukraine. We want to get to talking about those experiences, but first, Nick, let me just ask you, is it possible that Ukraine could actually win this war, push the aggressive Russians back?
It's a good question, Al, but the question is, what is win? So, we, the U.S., London especially, helped create this expectation of what Russia wanted because we talked about what we believed we stole accurately from the Russian military plans. That was essentially a plan for regime change, to sack, to siege Kyiv, and to throw out the Zelensky government and replace it with some kind of pliant puppet or create a rump state. So if that is what the Putin threshold is, or if that's what the Kremlin threshold is, then yeah, I think there's absolutely ways, and we're seeing it on the ground, that Ukraine can prevent that. One, Russian tactical mistakes, a lack of food, a lack of gas, a lack of, frankly, plans of communication for how some of its troops were going to proceed and maneuver toward Kyiv and maneuver toward other cities, but also an extraordinary resistance, almost like a guerrilla resistance, of individual units fighting in very small numbers, kind of around the side of the Russian lines in the forests, using American and NATO weapons to take out Russian vehicles, Russian tanks. And what we've seen that happen is that means that the columns that the Russians are using, they're immobilized. And so it's actually very effective simply at stopping them in their tracks, literally. But if the Russian goal instead is to seize southern Ukraine, cut Kyiv off from the coast, encircle Kyiv so that Kyiv gives up on NATO, seize more territory in the east, I think the Ukrainians are going to have a hard time preventing that.
Let me go back to what you just described, that incredibly effective guerrilla warfare. You reported on the extraordinary courage and resolve that you saw from so many Ukrainians over there, the military units to be sure, but just ordinary citizens. Describe that.
It is as if your very existence and your home are threatened. Your family's future is threatened. And a bigger country, a David compared to Goliath, if you will, as the Lviv mayor compared it. If Goliath is coming in and saying you have no right to exist as a nationality, I think, Al, we can completely understand that anybody whose family, whose house, whose very identity is threatened, you're going to fight to the last man. And so the Ukrainians have done that. And they've done that using some of the tactics and techniques and procedures that they've learned in the last 8 years of war. Remember, they've been fighting the Russians or Russian-backed separatists in the East since 2014. And so the U.S. and the UK have been training them a lot on some of these tactics. But it is an existential war, and that's why every single Ukrainian is fighting, is willing to fight to the death. And that leads to some of the more heartbreaking scenes that I've ever witnessed. I mean, I've covered half a dozen wars and conflicts, but I've never seen the kind of conflict that we're seeing today like we saw in Europe in 1940, which was that the men say goodbye to their children and to their wives, and sometimes grandma and grandpa who can leave. And they leave them at the border and they turn around to fight and volunteer. And so that's what we're seeing. In addition to, like we talked about, some of those weapons that have proved very effective that the U.S. and the West has given them.
One of your reports from there, you drove, I think, 500 miles from Odessa to near the Polish border, took over 20 hours, and you saw much of what is happening and the effort to escape in that harrowing journey. That must have been an extraordinary experience.
What's extraordinary about it is at times we're stopped in traffic, right? So we joined basically, if you draw a line from Odessa, which is on the Black Sea, which is the main port, one of the main ports that Ukraine has. If you draw a line due north, you hit Kyiv. So in the middle there is kind of the main artery, the I-40, if you will, of Ukraine. And so you get to I-40 or equivalent of it, and you make a left, and that goes to Poland. And so that means that everyone from the east, from Kharkiv, from Mariupol, from these cities that we now all know their names, all of those people leaving, they're also on I-40. And so traffic is just backed up. I think the first day of the war, the line at the Polish border was 40 miles long. I mean, it was literally a 4-day line. So now that's kind of cleared out a little bit, but in the middle of the country, there's still back-to-back traffic. So you get into this line and you just sit there. And so we took a walk, and we took a walk down the line. And what's extraordinary is a couple things. One, in almost every car, there's 8 people with children. We talked about because the men can't leave. Every car has a sign in the back that says "Dita," which is the word in Russian for child or for children, meaning children on board. Don't shoot us. And every single car, you just start asking questions. And these people need to talk. They want to talk because other people, frankly, aren't asking because they're also fleeing. And the stories they tell are just harrowing. The only reason that a parent will risk a gauntlet of Russian troops to leave their house is because their home is no longer safe. The only reason a parent would put a child on a boat is because the land isn't safe. Those ideas that we've heard from poets and authors the last few years of refugee crises were playing out every day in every car on that road, on that highway, every single one hoping for safety, knowing that the war is coming for them.
You mentioned Mariupol a moment ago. The Russians are bombing hospitals, children's centers, targeting civilians. You wrote about workers digging through the night to pull survivors out of the rubble after airstrikes. And I think you wrote the other day that the story of Mariupol is the story of this war.
It is, because the Russians are not able to perform what they wanted to perform. They weren't able to do shock and awe. They weren't able to seize Kyiv in some overnight capture using a nearby airport. And so they sit back and they lob artillery at residential neighborhoods. So they launch their missiles from inside Russia at apartment complexes. It is indiscriminate shelling into apartment blocks, into residential neighborhoods, and it is also very discriminate shelling at civilian targets. So they have destroyed a city that was 400,000 people. I mean, there's very little of it left. And not only did they destroy it, but they looked for the very place where women and children were sheltering, a theater. There were 1,000 people in the basement. Another location a couple days ago, 400 people. Direct hits on those targets. And so we will unfortunately be writing histories where if the first chapter is Stalingrad or Guernica, and the next chapter is Stalingrad, and the next chapter is Aleppo, unfortunately the chapter after that may be Mariupol. And that is what the Russians are willing to do.
James.
So how are the Ukrainian supplies holding up? Is the West able to get them supplies? And will we have to consider something like the Berlin airlift at some point because they can fight, but you can't fight without ammunition. You can't fight without food. You can't fight without, all of the other things we do. So tell us a little bit about the supply lines, and the Russians have to know that they if we can't take Kyiv, we'll have a siege. See Leningrad.
Absolutely. It's a great question, James, because, and I will say what I know about this is obviously through U.S. and Ukrainian and NATO officials. And frankly, everybody has a reason to not tell me the truth about this very question. So, let's take what we know with a grain of salt. But we know a couple of things. One, the Russians have promised to target those supply lines. And two, what the U.S. is saying is that they have had no problem getting it in. So let's take just the latest tranche of what Biden announced, 1,000 javelins, right? I mean, 1,000 individual packages of weapons that can take out a Russian vehicle, in addition to 400 Stingers, which are even a little larger. These is trucks and trucks and trucks and trucks full. There's no airlift because there's nothing flying into Ukraine, so it's all going overland, we believe, through Poland, and we believe it's getting there. Again, the Ukrainians, the Americans would have incentive not to tell us if the Russians suddenly hit it. But at the very least, we see the Ukrainian military using this stuff. And so far as we can tell, it's getting in. It's been used effectively. And there is no end in sight to how much the Americans and the West and NATO are willing to provide. They see the success that Ukraine is having with them. They want Russia to bleed. Ukrainians are like, it's almost like a proxy fight, right? They're fighting the Russians, and they're using American NATO weapons extremely effectively, and NATO and the U.S. want to keep that flow going.
So, well, we now know that the Russian Black Sea Fleet is shelling these coastal areas. We do have shore-to-ship missiles, like we have, land-to-air missile or something like that. Have you heard of any idea that we should get some of these things to the Ukrainians? Because the Russians have traditionally and still do have a really crappy navy.
Well, so what's interesting about that is that actually we're seeing that the Russian army may actually be weaker than we thought. And the Russian Navy...
Close contest.
Yeah, exactly. The Russian Navy actually has come a bit of a long way in the last 10 years, and we don't know yet for sure, but our assumptions about the Russian army were not quite right. But there is an assumption the Russian Navy actually, and the Marines that are still on those ships in the Black Sea that could come ashore still near Odessa are still there, and are still, at least so we think, well trained. The Ukrainians were asking for shore-to-ship weapons to place along the Black Sea and the Azov Sea coast, which is the other coast that they have in the southeast. To my knowledge, we never gave them to them because that was deemed an offensive weapon, quote unquote. Someone will have to define the difference between a defensive and offensive weapon to me one day, but meaning that you could take a weapon and shoot over a border, or you could take a weapon and shoot much further than a weapon where, if you're looking at a tank, clearly an invader, clearly right there, that's a, quote, defensive weapon. So as far as I know, the Americans, NATO never provided those. The Ukrainians have some of their own. We have not seen them use them as far as we can tell.
Well, every Navy looks pretty good till it gets shot at. So we'll see where it goes from here. We got to know that there's nothing more than Putin and the Russians would want would be to capture Zelensky. And, of course, the Ukrainians know that, and Zelensky knows that. Your sense is, how safe is Zelensky? I mean, is he pretty well protected? Is he moving around? What's going on there? Because he is the biggest target of the 21st century, maybe bigger than bin Laden.
He is presumably Russia's number one target, although we've seen some reporting, but not a lot, on actual attempts at his life, in part, frankly, because Russia hasn't seized Kyiv or hasn't really even surrounded Kyiv. So I have no doubt that I'm sure there's some saboteurs out there, as the Ukrainians call them, who would love to take that shot. He is very well protected. He does move around, though. And so what I think we've seen from his team, and remember, he's an actor, he's a comedian, he's more than that. He's a real institution when it comes to entertainment, by the way, in Russian. He was never a Ukrainian language entertainer. He was always a Russian language entertainer who was popular in Russia. But what they've done is they've taken their skills and his skills in presentation, in rhetoric, and to quote the line about Churchill, they've mobilized the Ukrainian language for battle. And so
I'll turn it back. Go ahead.
And so they've shown him in his office, all with facing the windows, lots of glass, doing a selfie. They've shown him walking through the streets of Kyiv. Fine, it's around the presidential office, but still on the streets of Kyiv. And he has tried to mobilize the idea that this is a black and white war, a good and evil war, using those skills he's had, and he has not hidden more than at least we've seen him hide a little bit.
So I'm talking right back there. I'll just make a point. I talked to a close friend of Al Franken's, and I said, tell Al he needs to run for election again because Zelensky's made it cool to be a Jewish comedian.
That's right. And just to that point, you know, the rhetoric from Zelensky, right, to American audience, not I have a dream, I have a need, right, to the German audience, you know, Mr. Scholz, tear down this wall between democracy and authoritarianism. To the Japanese audience, there is a tsunami hitting my country today. They have done an extraordinary job at getting, especially Europe, to a point where they can make political decisions that Europeans thought impossible a month ago. And they've used his skills at that. And, you know, again, it goes without saying, but it can't say it enough. The notion of denazifying a country with a Jewish president. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. Nick, let me go back a moment to something. Several former NATO commanders in the last couple of days have called not for a free-fly zone, but a humanitarian zone with protections. Now, that would have risk, too. The Russians may not like that much. But when I hear former NATO commanders, I think 3 of them, say that's what we're going to have to do. It's just a matter of when. What's your reporting suggest?
There's not really a no-fly zone's a no-fly zone's a no-fly zone.
Right.
It is really not easy. It requires American, presumably, and some European jets over the skies of Ukraine with authority to kill. Right, you can't enforce a no-fly zone unless you are willing to push the button on the side of that jet and destroy a Russian jet.
How would a humanitarian zone be different then?
I'm not. To me, I don't see a lot of evidence that it would be. There are people on the ground who are trying to figure out a way to get what the Ukrainians call green corridors, so literally corridors out of places like Kharkiv and Mariupol, and even Odessa through Mykolaiv. And the Ukrainians call them green corridors. We would call them kind of safe corridors or safe passages. Mm-hmm. Those are individually negotiated between Ukrainian authorities, Russian authorities. The ICRC head has been in Ukraine. Today is in Moscow. He's in the middle of some of those negotiations. The UN has also been in those. So if that's what we're talking about, that's already happening. But from what I've read about these proposals, they still require a level of protection from the sky, and it's just not going to happen. The U.S. and NATO have just said they're not willing. What instead they're trying to do, excuse me, is get a kind of de facto no-fly zone, and that would be sending what NATO calls SA-8s, S-300s that we know. These are air defense systems that could shoot down Russian jets. Not really Russian ballistic missiles, maybe some Russian cruise missiles. That's a kind of de facto no-fly zone, and the U.S. is clearly working with allies and some of the Eastern Bloc countries that have those weapons.
Nick, you also have a lot of expertise on Russia. You did a documentary. What's the best explanation of why Putin so clearly miscalculated?
I think I will quote Masha Gessen, who I'm sure you guys know and many of the listeners know, a well-known Russian activist and advocate. And Masha talks about this idea that the Kremlin is no longer a government, that Putin has created an oligarchy is the words of some other experts. I think her words are essentially a kind of mafia in which there's a captain, that is Putin, and he has lieutenants. And what happens when you create a government like that, that's kind of based on violence and money, everybody gets a share and everybody's participating in the violence, is that the captain will kind of lead a meeting and say, geez, it's like Shakespearean. Wouldn't it be great if this Zelensky guy wasn't our problem anymore? If he was really just gone. You know what? I got to go to the bathroom. I got to go. Discuss amongst yourselves, right? What Masha calls emanations from the leader. And I think what has happened, according to the better Russia watchers that I talked to, is that he's no longer getting the advice of a head of government. He is caught in his own feedback loop. And we saw these extraordinary scenes the day of or the day before the invasion, where he recognized the, quote, independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, the breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine, and he dressed down the head of his foreign intelligence service. And the guy got up and he was stammering, and Putin's like, speak clearly, and just badgering him, disparaging him. And the guy's clearly nervous, clearly trying to suggest, hey, maybe this isn't such a good idea, boss. And Putin wanted none of it. So I think that's the best guess. Frankly, it is a guess that people have. He's just no longer getting normal government advice. He's getting what his people think he wants to hear.
Well, he's a cornered rat now, as he once wrote about. So what does a cornered rat do in that situation?
Well, I will not repeat the characterization, obviously. But what U.S. officials are worried about is that I think the president's words were, he's up against a wall or something like that. They're worried that a more desperate leader will, one, resort to some of the scorched earth tactics that we've already talked about, artillery into residential blocks, missiles into residential blocks. But the great fear is non-conventional weapons. So most obviously chemical and biological. And I say most obviously for two reasons. One, Putin and his allies in the Syrian government have been willing to use chemical weapons in the past. So they've used them in Syria, as we've seen so horrifically. And also Russian state intelligence cutouts have used chemical weapons in the United Kingdom to target what the Kremlin perceived as one of its enemies. So that's there. And two, the Russians are talking about the American biological labs, which is a lie, in Ukraine, American chemical weapons in Ukraine. So that false flag is a real red flag, if you will, or a real red warning light that maybe they're thinking of it. And the bigger threat is nuclear, of course. And the people I talk to say there's no intelligence to base there's no intelligence that suggests any kind of imminent nuclear attack. And when I say nuclear, we're not talking about the strategic, big kind of city destroyers. The Russians have what they call tactical nuclear weapons or battlefield nuclear weapons, still a nuke. But and the problem there is that Gerasimov, their equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has written extensively over the years that it is Russian doctrine to escalate using tactical nuclear weapons, what we call escalate to de-escalate. They don't use that phrase, but that's effectively what it is. They've talked about it in the past. And so that is the fear if President Putin feels somehow cornered.
James?
So let's assume they use, quote, tactical nuclear weapons. A friend of ours who's pretty knowledgeable said it's it's like a chain of command, that he could face some resistance. But so he does that. And the wind blows the wrong way. And it goes over Poland. All right? Does that activate Article 5?
It's a fantastic. It's a great question, and we asked Jack Reed, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, exactly that, and he said something interesting.
Man,
he said something interesting this morning, which I hadn't heard, and I don't think Chairman Reed is necessarily reflecting 100% what the administration's thinking, but clearly, as the Democratic chairman of the Armed Services Committee, he's going to know what's going on. He said, in a hypothetical scenario where there's a non-conventional use and radiation were to cross the border, and by the way, that's like totally possible. Like the wind literally just needs to be blowing west. It's not even the wrong way. It's blowing west.
Yeah.
He said he could foresee a scenario where NATO claims an attack on NATO, even though the weapon was aimed and exploded inside Ukraine. He could see the possibility of the President of the United States, Secretary General of NATO, and the NAC, the NATO Atlantic Council, the political body that makes decisions for NATO, saying yes, Article 5, because of a radiation leak or because of chemicals floating over into Poland or another NATO country. So I know they're thinking about it. They're worried about it. I'm not quite convinced that they've really come to terms with that scenario and what they would do, but they're definitely talking about it. And obviously the president's in Brussels tomorrow to talk about that, among other things.
So I'm turning back to Al. you never, and I know this is speculation, and I'm asking you to speculate. I know journalists hate to speculate because it's not what you're trained to do. But if you had to give a best guess, how do you think this ends?
Well, what was it that Yogi Berra said? Prediction is hard, especially about the future.
Yeah, right. Right. But I understand.
It's deja vu.
But everybody is asking that question. I mean, people ask me. It has to have. It's become, doctrine that he has to have an exit. Henry Kissinger says you got to figure a way to, that he can save face.
Right.
Whatever. That's become part of the conversation.
Yeah. What's the exit ramp is still a great question, and unfortunately, and I know this for sure, the very top of the U.S. government does not see an exit ramp, unfortunately, because one, as we talked about, the West defined Putin's plan so early and so publicly as regime change, and Putin has suggested it. So if that's victory, geez, you're a long way from that. And Putin does need to achieve victory for his own standing in the world. But what I think we're going to see, and this is less about speculation and more based on what we're seeing already, the Russians can do what they are doing in Ukraine right now. And like we've said, that's missiles, a lot of dumb bombs, so to speak, a lot of artillery raining on residential neighborhoods. They can do that for a long time. They may not be able to seize Kyiv. They may not be able to seize Odessa. We don't know yet. But they can certainly stay where they are for many, many, many months. And it will be a test between the Ukrainian military and an army of volunteers who are fighting and their Western weapons with the political willingness of the Kremlin to keep going. I don't see the Russian military really changing because they're just going to doing what they're doing. But it is the Kremlin versus the Ukrainian military who will play this out. And assuming there's no kind of quick armistice where Ukraine agrees to something that Russia's willing to accept, we will see this for months and months and months. We will see the civilian toll just increase. And we will see a slow war of attrition. The attrition will be both of the Ukrainian military and the Kremlin's willingness to accept pain. If we see body bags of Russian conscripts going back to Russia, I assure you there will be political pressure on Putin. If we don't see those body bags, maybe less pressure. We're going to see a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian military, but the U.S. will continue to give them weapons. So that's, I think, the contest that's going to play out. But unfortunately, it's going to play out over many months, it seems, at great cost to the people of Ukraine, to the country of Ukraine. But they are trying to stand firm and save their country. But there's not very much that they can do to evict Russia. All they'll be able to do is stall it.
Well, that's a realistically, if bleak assessment. Nick, your reporting has been terrific. You and now your colleague Jane Ferguson over there, and I understand one or two other half-decent journalists at the NewsHour. So we thank you for joining us, and all of you out there, watch Nick Schifrin. Nick, before we go, we just got some very sad news. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, a great champion of democracy with their Eastern European roots, she has just passed away. She really was a giant of the American foreign policy establishment, wasn't she?
She was a giant of the American foreign policy establishment, a giant of America. What we stand for, or what so much of America stands for, the ability of someone like her and her family to escape what they did, and for her to reach the highest pinnacle of American diplomacy when she did. Someone who was not afraid to use force. We've been talking about war. Famously told Colin Powell, well, if you got such a shiny military, why aren't you willing to use it in the Balkans to save people? A champion of human rights across the world, both obviously behind the Iron Curtain and when she was younger, and America standing as a beacon, and someone who I know was a real role model for so many diplomats and senior officials in this U.S. government today.
And young women.
And young women also.
James, you knew her?
Yeah, I mean, I do not well, but better than how you doing, Madam Secretary, and what an elegant person, and what personal the combination of personal and professional accomplishments, and her book was unbelievable. I mean, people like that made the United States, and she is it's a very distressing thing to hear, and she was a very. She was very nice. She was very approachable. I mean, she didn't have a whiff of arrogance about her. So I am saddened by this, and doesn't look like we got a lot of people on the bench to replace her right now, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it is. And my wife and I periodically would have dinner with Madeleine, and two things: you always learned something. She always had some insights, and she was fun. Yeah. She wasn't a stiff. She really, really was fun. So,
right. Yeah.
She had an extraordinary life, as Nick said, with from her early roots, and at an early age in Washington. Her husband left her, and she had 2 little kids, and her achievements are just the stuff of legacy. So, Madeleine Albright, we miss you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We sure do.
Hey, James, I watched almost all the first 3 days, or at least 2.5 days, of the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings on Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson. First, never having seen her before, this is a really impressive jurist. She's going to add real value to that high court. She was calm, she was cool, she was smart, she was versed. She knew exactly how to handle those senators. But the other thing is the Republican behavior, with few exceptions, was vile and demagogic. Lindsey Graham started off by saying, we're not going to treat you the way Brett Kavanaugh was going to treat you. We'll treat you with dignity and fairness. Republicans then proceeded to describe her as a criminal, coddling, child porn sympathizing, drug dealing supporting black nationalist radical. All totally false. Fact checkers have noted that. Graham, who I always think of, James, and as Chris Buckley described him as Squiggly Tea Biscuit, he attacked her for representing terrorists. She was a public defender on Guantanamo. It's what we do in this country. Everybody deserves representation. He also erroneously tried to link her, or support for her, to the left-wing activist and the favorite right-wing target, Jewish billionaire and philanthropist George Soros, who he falsely claimed sabotaged his home state candidate, Judge Childs. Now, let me say something, James, and you and I know this. Our dear friend Walter Dellinger, who passed away 5 weeks ago, about a week before Judge Jackson was nominated, was deeply involved in the process. He talked with the president and others, and he condemned a few left-wing groups' criticism of Judge Childs, who's from South Carolina. But he said that had nothing to do with a choice. He thought Judge Jackson would be chosen because of the breadth of her experience and her gravitas. And I would just finally say that Biscuit, who used to bring some Southern charm to these proceedings when John Cain was his mentor, his political daddy, since he switched to Trump, he's just an angry, spiteful bully.
I hadn't watched a single second of it. And I'll tell you what, I knew exactly what was going to happen. There is not a single surprising thing. And am I surprised that they plunge the depths that they have on this? Of course not. It's what they do. But don't worry, we lost Madeleine Albright, we lost Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but we got Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz coming up to replace him. I mean, that's what's the disgusting thing. But I don't, I read about it, I look at a couple of clips, and I get so disgusted that I just can't do it. I'm sorry. I apologize to our listeners. I realize that I co-host a podcast. I should do this, but I'll get you to watch so I don't have to.
Thanks, James. You get the assignment next time. It might even be worse than you expected. Josh Hawley focused predominantly on child porn cases, ignoring the fact that her sentencing as a district judge, before she was a court of appeals judge, was in line with the vast majority of other judges. The obsession that guys like Hawley and Ken Starr have on sex-related issues is truly strange. And then there was Tom Cotton. Tom Cotton, who tries to pretend he's the smartest guy in the room. He and Judge Jackson both went to Harvard Law School. She graduated with honors. He did not. She was a Supreme Court clerk. He was not. I think maybe a little bit of envy there from that, personality challenge, Senator. And finally, your favorite, James, Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz, the one who begged forgiveness from Tucker Carlson, we'll remember, was that tough guy playing the racial dog whistle while quoting Martin Luther King. He tried to paint her as soft on crime. Now, interestingly, besides being bogus, the night before the hearings began in Bozeman, Montana, he had failed to check in for his flight, and he got furious and yelled and screamed at a attendant there, a desk person for the airlines. They had to call the police in, and this great tough guy on crime, Ted Cruz, proceeded to berate the cop, too. So, Ted, go back to Cancun.
I mean, again, none of this is remarkably surprising. None of it. And of course, the great airport incident that I've read about in the last 12 hours is that Paul Manafort was taken off of a plane in Miami trying to go to Dubai with a revoked passport. I mean, I don't think there's much difference between Paul Manafort and Ted Cruz.
Are you talking about Putin's consultant or indirectly Paul Manafort? The same one, huh?
Yeah,
Trump campaign manager.
Guys like you say, I mean, it's just too. I can't. I'm sorry. I just can't get outraged by these people. It's just so evident who they are, and they keep reminding us. And I don't know. It's like
you are right, James. But the next hearing like this for Politics War Room, you have the watch duty.
Okay.
Okay. Hey, James, a number of good questions again this week. The first is from Elizabeth in Mount Lake Terrace, Washington. I have never been there, but boy, Mount Lake Terrace, Washington
sounds like it's beautiful.
I want to go there. I
want to go, yeah.
Let's get a gig in Mount Lake Terrace, Washington. Elizabeth, find a way to invite us out there, will you, please? She says, do you suspect that, like the previous president, Tucker Carlson is on the take from Russia? Is anyone trying to follow the money here? Why not?
I think that Putin, but Tucker has never, would tell you quite honestly, he's not a big fan of democracy. Putin and Tucker's worldview, I doubt, are significantly that far apart. Now, what's interesting is I was reading a piece where these Republicans are using ads, just taking Tucker's answer language and just putting it on the air. But I'm really not all that surprised by this. And other people that know him well, can't tell you their names, but his initials are Paul Begala, would tell you that, who knows him even better than I do, we did a show together, this is not totally out of character for Tucker. This is not a reversal or anything like that. It's probably an enhancement of the way that he felt. And there's this unbelievable fascination among these ethno-nationalist right-wing Republicans in the United States for Putin. And, I don't get it, but that's the way they look at the world.
I agree, Elizabeth, with James. I don't think he's getting money from the Russians. He's making a fortune from Fox by voicing despicable views. They aren't views you disagree with. They are despicable. They really are. They're racist. They're anti-democratic. But, it's who he is. The next question is from Gerald in Nashville, Tennessee. Gerald says, as often as said, hope is not a strategy. As a proud liberal, Gerald wants to know why the Democrats are so smug and lazy to believe these are winning ideas, even as they're proven wrong every election cycle. Well, Gerald, let me slightly quarrel with you. I'll go back, and I'm stealing this from James. 2018 was a model of what to talk about. It was issues that people cared about. Sure, it may have been a little bit easier because you were criticizing an incumbent administration, but you can replicate those same issues in a slightly different way now and not get caught up with all this kind of crazy cultural stuff of Latinx and defund the police. So I think, it's 7 months away and time is wasting, as they say, Gerald. But I think if the Democrats want to come up with a message that we have ideas, we've done some good things, there's some more good things that we can do, and do you really want to go back to the old Trump days? they're not out of the realm of having a better November than people think.
Yeah, I'm trying to agree with you, but
It's a reach.
You should read Tom Metzl. I think Tom may be a little more overly pessimistic, but the stench that these leftists have left on the party is just so hard to get rid of, and it was so idiotic and so stupid and so damaging, and there's such a small part of the Democratic coalition. And again, talking this morning to, posters and people, and, what they have done. Look what they did to Donna Shalala, who's been, was Donna's great experience. They killed us in South Florida, and you can thank the squad and all their supporters for that.
Yep.
You can just thank them for it.
Yeah, you can.
In the foundations and the universities, these are just the most politically. There's people, and I'm one of them, that think that they that they hate the party and that they like doing damage. It makes them feel good. I don't know. Maybe it is. I think there's some truth to that. I think they think that having Republicans in there and Ted Cruz in power is good for fundraising. I really believe that.
Mike in Oak Park, Illinois, listened to our show last week, James. And
Okay.
Your idea about using Visa, Amazon, Apple customers list to send information to people about what truly is happening in the Ukraine. Let's do it now, Mike says. Do it daily till this evil is thwarted. No reason to wait. What will it take to get everybody on board?
Yeah, well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. I have a lot of bad ideas. But, you can imagine the number of contacts that we have. They order from Amazon. They have iPhones. We have all of this. And, the people that do that are, by nature, going to be a little more fluent, going to be a little more educated. You can start sowing doubt because, as Nick said, this is going to be attrition. They're just going to keep shelling. And, the more pain that we can bring through these sanctions and through public information campaigns, if you will, the more that we're going to be helping Ukraine. This can be as effective as sending, stingers and javelins.
Yep. No, it really can be. And it was, you and Peter last week, I think, really had a terrific idea on this, and it ought to happen now, and there ought to be some pressure on people to do it. James, I'm going to steal a question from New Orleans. It's from Henry down there, and he poses this hypothetical. He said, if President Obama nominated Judge Jackson in 2016, would that have enabled Hillary to have won? I assume that Obama nominated the consensus judge because of informal assurances of various Republicans they would back that nomination. Henry, no. I don't think that if he had nominated Judge Jackson, first of all, I think she had just been a district court judge for a couple of years then. I think the Republicans almost certainly would have gone even more crazy on her. Garland was the kind of choice that you wanted to get through a Republican Senate until Mitch McConnell cheated. And that's what he did. He cheated. They're talking a lot about packing the court. And Mike Lee and others, Chuck Grassley, say, we don't want to increase the size of the court. Well, Mitch McConnell decided for an entire year he would change the size of the court. He did change the size of the court. He refused to have a hearing, so we had an 8-person court for a year because of Mitch McConnell. And that, as much as anything that they accuse Democrats are doing, is what really, really caused, I think, the distrust of the court, the sense that the court is a political institution. That was outrageous what happened back then. And Henry, I'm with you on that outrage, but it wouldn't have made any difference if he nominated a Judge Jackson type.
I agree 100%. I think Henry had an insightful question, and I think it was a really insightful answer. By the way, Henry, and people need to know this, tornadoes in New Orleans in the spring are very rare. They usually don't come to Houston or New Orleans or Mobile. That's more of a, Dallas, Oklahoma City, Shreveport, Jackson, kind of Birmingham problem. And that was a pretty, you'd think, well, one person got killed, so you can't say thank God. Of course, it lands in the lower Ninth Ward. Looks like tornadoes seek poor people out. But it was pretty frightening. I wasn't there, but my wife was there, and she sent me some pictures. And This is not a usual thing down there. We're not in Tornado Alley.
James, Angie in Georgetown, Texas. I've been to several Georgetowns, obviously here in Washington, but also out in Colorado.
It's in Central Texas.
Is it?
Nice, yeah, I think so.
Well, she asked a good question about that Republican Party in there. She said, I thought Republicans, the party that stood for fewer government rules and laws, and the pro-life party. So why are these Texas leaders making more rules and laws that affect the quality of life of children and their parents?
It's a good question, and I think the answer is they're just cruel people. I think we sometimes we overthink this, but there could be other reasons. But I mean, the Texas Republicans as a group are just kind of gratuitous. My new hero, by the way, let me give a shout out, is the governor of Utah. Right? They passed one of these anti-trans things, and a guy, I think his name was like Spencer Cox, and he said, look, there's 75,000 people that play high school sports in Utah, 4 trans, 1 competes as a girl. This is a solution looking for a problem.
Amen.
And they have like these unbelievably high this is sheer cruelty. Nothing but just cruelty. I mean, these are really complicated human beings. But we should have counseling and anything that we can. And it's taken 4 people out of 75,000 and making them to an issue, and it's just cruelty.
And they want to hurt him.
Yes, I got to give the guy a real shout out, and his logic was totally impeccable.
James, I couldn't agree with you more. I hope I'm right on this. I think the governor of Indiana may have done the same thing.
He did. I think so. I didn't get. I just happened to see the governor of Utah's reasoning, and it was like, I said, well, what about? I said, let the high school athletic association figure that out.
Absolutely.
That's not a question for the legislature.
Right. Or if it's college, let the NCAA, the Ivy League determine that, or University of Pennsylvania.
What makes the difference between a 3A and a 2A schools?
Right.
1,000 students or 800? That's not the legislature's problem.
It's not the business of politicians. Stay the hell out of it.
Right.
James, for our next question, I'm actually going to follow one of last week. One of our terrific listeners last week asked what Trump could do with, I think he's raised about $100 million. Are there any limits on it? So we promised to go to the expert on that, the great Fred Wertheimer, who has explained that Trump can basically do anything he wants with that money. He can use it to buy planes, boats, take trips, pay off people from before. But if he uses it for personal use, he has to pay taxes on it. And we know that Donald Trump sometimes can be a little bit shady on whether he pays taxes. But that's the answer for last week. So Fred Wertheimer, thank you.
He's going to use it for personal use. I can promise you that. Whether he pays taxes or not, I don't know.
Our final question is from Eric in Westlake Village, California, who asked a good question. Will the Ukraine lessen the impact of the January 6th committee and its findings and reports? It was a threat to our democracy being broadcast all over, but the war in Ukraine is a global threat and it commands all of our attention now.
That's a very good question. And it's a question worth pondering. I don't know. It certainly dominates everything, but we still hear about inflation. But of course, people experience inflation every time they turn around. But that's a good question. I think I would defer to you, who understands this a little better than I do.
I really don't, James, because I agree. It's a good question. And first of all, I guess it depends on what the situation is going to be like in Ukraine in another month or two. It depends on, how dramatic the hearings, the findings. I'm sure it's going to be some bad stuff that the committee comes up with. So it's a really good question. And
it is. And if I was Putin is going to use a tactical nuclear weapon, I'd probably use it the day this came out. Could bury that story pretty easily.
He don't want anything to hurt his friend Trump, that's for sure.
Right.
All right, well, please keep those questions coming in.
Great questions.
I mean, your questions out there are so good. And when we don't know the answer, which sometimes happens, as it did last week, I promise we'll get to somebody who does. So please keep them coming. Thank you.
Some of our listeners can give us the answer. I bet you they know it as much as anybody else.
Hey, James, Kamala Harris has not exactly had a distinguished run as vice president, but one criticism last week was beyond dirty. She was criticized for being ugly to Ukrainian refugees in Poland. First, it was a lie. But the real outrage was the charge was made by Stephen Miller, the hate-mongering Trump immigration guru who delighted in separating children from their families. Miller talking about someone being insensitive about refugees, of course, is like Putin complaining about repression. Miller is a destructive immigration basher. He's now an advisor to Pennsylvania Republican Senate candidate David McCormick. Mr. McCormick, are you simpatico with Miller on this issue?
Well, one good reason to pull against Duke, and probably a lot, is that Stephen Miller is a Duke grad, I think.
Oh, I won't tell my wife.
I don't want to slander Duke without saying, but I think that Will Leach, who's on New York Magazine, had a good, funny piece about who to pull for in the NCAA tournament.
Bob Novak used to always pull for the team that was closest to his political ideology. So it didn't matter, if Alabama played Michigan, he always was going to cheer for Alabama.
I never pull for LSU.
yeah. You had Novak. Duke has Stephen Miller. You had Novak. Pulling for you.
I got take it. It ain't never. The outrage is the government of the state of Israel. All right, now they refuse to sell this very effective spyware to Ukraine because they didn't want to offend the Russians. All right. First of all, Putin today is talking about rootless cosmopolitans. That's right out of the Stalin anti-Semitic playbook. And by the way, what's Russia ever done for Israel? I actually think that the United States was very, very, very influential in the forming the state of Israel. I think Harry Truman did it at great risk.
Yep.
I think the Iron Dome has protected them to the nth degree. And I talked to our friend Jim Gerstein before I did this, and he said, actually, the people of Israel definitely don't like this decision. At some point, and they understand. They say, well, we got the Russians in Syria, and we got a lot of things to navigate, and it's complicated. You know what? That's just not sufficient answer. That's just not a sufficient answer. And I know there's a lot of people that listen to this show that really care about Israel, really like the Israeli people. But I think this is a spineless act by this government. And again, Putin is engaging in this anti-Semitic talk. To me, it's just an outrage.
Couldn't agree with you more, James. I guess I would have expected of Netanyahu. I'm surprised by Bennett, and nobody knows the situation better than Jim Gerstein.
Right, and there's no, all you can say about Bennett is he's not Netanyahu, but that's about it.
Yeah. Okay.
And I don't know why our ambassador, if I was, Blinken, I'd call the Israeli ambassador into my office.
Yeah, and our ambassador over there, Tom Nides, ought to be raising hell with him.
Absolutely, absolutely. And apparently this stuff is really effective. I mean, you can imagine it, very, advanced.
Well, he went to visit Putin in Moscow, which I thought, that's fine.
Okay, yeah,
maybe
done that. Want to have a backdoor negotiation.
Absolutely, but to continue to play footsie with the Russians is just, inexcusable. It really is.
Nope.
And it really is the antithesis of everything Israel is supposed to stand for.
Right.
I agree. Hey, thanks for listening to Politics War Room with James Carville, and I'm Al Hunt. Don't forget to send your questions for us by email to politicswarroom@gmail.com or tweet them for next week's show at Politicon. So to keep up with us, subscribe to Politics War Room on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. Please rate the show with a 5-star review. We'll be back next week with another show as we continue our War Room planning.